I think that's an even longer introduction than Brian's, but and I know you're probably thinking of the tea break, so bear with me, and I thank you for your patience. I suppose this evening I was invited by Vita House to talk about addiction and its effects on family, and a lot of the previous speakers have alluded to, I suppose, the concept of family and how we're impacted either positively or negatively, and unfortunately with drugs and alcohol it can have a lot of negative impacts on families. I'm not going to bore you with too many definitions or slides, but I suppose when we think about drugs, we kind of look at it and say, well, what are they? Why do people take them? And people take them to change the way they feel, think, or behave. And if you think about it, if you're living with someone that actually changes how they think, behaves, or feels when they're under the influence of a substance, that can be quite hurtful because it almost feels like there's a different person. Lots of people will take drugs. They will take licit drugs. They will take illicit drugs. Illicit drugs would be things like maybe prescribed painkillers and things like that. We've seen an increase over the last few years in terms of benzos and sleeping tablets and things like that. Alcohol is another one. We don't know exactly how many people take drugs in this country. We can only work on stats such as treatment figures, seizures, and I mean kind of Garda seizures, not actual seizures, even though some people will have them too. But we also don't know why. Lots of people can take drugs. They might take them for a while or they might take them periodically and then move on. Typically teenagers, for example, will experiment, but a certain percentage will go on and develop an addiction. There are many theories of addiction, and not one, I suppose, resonates more than the other. So it depends, I suppose, on what school of thought maybe you might find yourself. So, for example, we have what's called the disease model. Some people will call it an actual disease, a physical and biological and a spiritual disorder, I suppose, or depletion. Others would regard it as a brain disorder. For others, it might be a genetic disorder, that there's a heritability factor in developing an addiction. And for others, it might be other factors like social learning. We're in a position now where a lot of drugs are very available and very accessible, and people are in a position to access them quite readily. And there's one other kind of theory, I suppose, that resonates, and we see a lot of it, and a lot of young people would tell us, is that they take them because they want to cope with stress, or that they want to relieve themselves from pain. I often ask people, why did you take the drugs? What was it for you? And they might say, well, first of all, it was out of curiosity, or it was out of boredom, or I wanted to experiment. But when we move into addiction, they often say, I wanted relief from pain, or I wanted to soothe myself from pain. There's some sense of escape. And I think sometimes the question is, and we don't often maybe ask it enough, what are we escaping from, and why are we trying to escape from it? Why do we go down that route? So in terms of addiction, and I know a lot of people have mentioned families already, I would say everybody in the family is impacted in some way by someone else's addiction, whether that person lives in the home or not. There was a train of thought years ago that it was only really the person that was using drugs, whoever was substance dependent or the addict, they're the ones that were impacted. Families weren't kind of given, I suppose, the understanding or the compassion that they deserved, that living with addiction can be extremely traumatic, can be extremely painful. And in many cases, when we talk about who is to blame, families themselves would be blamed. So if somebody went into treatment a number of years ago, it was your mammy's fault, your daddy's fault, your great-grandfather's fault, and we do talk about intergenerational stuff. For me, I find it very hard, particularly if I talk to parents, because they will blame themselves. It's not even other people's judging them or society. They'll judge themselves even as well. They will kind of turn around and they will say, what did I do wrong? How did I go wrong with him? You know, and sometimes even if it's parents in particular, you know, they'll get into arguments or they'll blame each other. You were too soft on him. Oh, well, you were too hard on him, do you know? And it's very, very difficult. And I suppose it isn't really about blame, because if we go back and think, we don't really know what causes addiction. We don't know why some people are more susceptible than others. So who are we going to blame? It also poses kind of an ethical question at times in terms of, if we don't really know what causes it, do we know best how we're treating it? Okay? And I think the one thing that I would kind of ask for people is, we're never too far away, and I guarantee if I was to go around the room this evening, everybody would know somebody. You may even be connected to somebody yourself that would be impacted by some form of addiction. I talk about primarily drugs and alcohol, but addiction can work right across the board, whether it's shopping, sex, gambling, etc., etc. So who and what suffers? We talk about the family, but also the communities suffer. In terms of safety, in terms of compassion, in terms of a healthiness, and somebody mentioned earlier about kind of a healthy community. I think when we talk about it though, no one is more impacted than the person that's using drugs themselves, because they are in pain. And by the time somebody comes to look for help or in treatment, they are in a lot of pain. They have a lot of shame. They have a lot of guilt. We also sometimes say they have a lot of denial, but that's kind of part of kind of coming to terms with how they've managed to live and maybe the things that they've done over the last number of years. But families themselves, I suppose when we talk about addiction, for some, it might be a slow process. The process of someone developing addiction can take a long time. It may happen over months or years. It kind of seeps in to some family homes. But for others, it can happen quite quickly. And that might sometimes depend on the type of drug they're taking, their personality, their environment, etc. When we talk about families, and I'll talk about it in kind of two separate pieces, I'll talk about adults and I'll talk about children, because some of the impacts can be a little bit different. And I suppose in ways, and this is one of the questions that I'll pose to yourselves, do families talk about it? Do families talk about addiction themselves? We're a great nation in this country to talk about everyone else bar ourselves. We even talk in the third party, and I'm pretty guilty of it myself. But it's one of those very, very kind of private things that we try to keep within the family unit itself. And that in itself can be soul destroying, because addiction grows on silence. Addiction grows on emptiness and shame. And I suppose if we think about then, well, how do families try to deal with it? Because if they're not talking about it, it can be very difficult to deal with it. And you'll often find families try to deal with it themselves for years. When I worked in treatment, we used to often say to family members, in some ways you're even sicker than the addict. Now it's a little bit dated, that type of term, but what it really means is that one person that can actually get sick, the other people are sick around, because you're worried, because you've got a sense of shame, because you're trying to fix somebody. When you love somebody and they're gone off and they're drinking or they're drugging, there's nothing more powerless than standing there knowing I cannot do anything for my wife, my husband, my child. So families typically try to deal with it themselves. And, people will look back even when they're sharing their own stories and family members and they go, God, I can't believe how crazy I was. I even had a family member ring me recently about her son. She's after sending him over to the other side of the world to do kickboxing. Now, it might work, I don't know, but it felt like it was a one way of kind of trying to deal with it. But for someone else, it might be, well, do we put him out of the house? Do we keep him in? And all those kind of battles that go on. I am also a little bit conscious when I'm talking about families, because every family is unique, and even the experience of addiction within a family can be unique. So I feel like I'm very much generalising a very, very serious problem, so kind of apologies for that. This is a slide I took from ADFAM, which is an organisation in the UK that do a lot of advocacy work. But when you talk about impacts on family members, these are just really kind of a snapshot. We're seeing of late, particularly in the last couple of years, I get a lot more calls around drug debts, families getting into difficulties. One mother that I worked with, they remortgaged their house for 30,000 to pay off debts. And that's another 20 years onto their mortgage type thing. For others, it can be difficult to even maintain work during stress. If you've got this going on at home, if you're worried about somebody coming home or whatever, or whether children will be collected from school, or will the dinner be cooked, it's very hard to kind of focus on your work and try not to worry about these type things. Another thing I suppose that we're coming across more so in the last few years is grandparents are now being financially impacted more than ever as well. So not only have they got the concern about maybe their son or daughter, they're now worried about their grandchildren. And sometimes, and particularly this time of year, kids are going back to school and things like that, and grandparents will say they not only don't have the energy, but they don't have the financial means. We talk about physical health. And again, if you're dealing with something for a long time, that you're worried, you know, and I hear it's almost conflictual. Some people will tell you, oh, I can't sleep, I worry about him, what if he doesn't come home tonight, you know? And for other people then it's the opposite. What if he does come home tonight? You know, that they're walking on eggshells, that they're worried about their kids, and things like that. They may experience domestic violence in the home, there may be physical abuse. And these things tend to kind of get worse over time. And when you're a family member and the first time something like this happens, you try to deal with it. And then the next day and the next day, you get worn down, you get worn out. That kind of leads to stress. And I think we're talking about, and different speakers have mentioned stress and the harms that it can do. Long-term stress can be so damaging to the body and to the mind. And when we talk about stress, we're talking about, you know, physical pain, back pain, headaches, stomach pains, things like that. I often ask people when they go to the doctor, when they come to me, and I say, have you spoken to the doctor? Yes, I've got pain relief, or I've got anti-anxiety tablets, or he's given me sleeping tablets. And I'd say, have you spoken about your son or daughter having a problem? No, I haven't. And there's no association then with maybe distress and what's going on in the home. And they often don't associate it either, you know. So, and when we talk about, I suppose, stress, then the pressures that it puts on family relationships, each individual in the family, while they work as a unit, may have different opinions and thoughts on how a family should operate and what they should do with their loved one that's abusing substances. For some, it's the threats, the dealing, the manipulating, the coercing, the pleading, and often families that I've worked with, they've tried everything. You know, they've tried, I've promised him, I gave him money, I paid for this, I paid for him to go away and do a course, all this type of thing. And if you've got kind of, you know, siblings maybe living in the family as well, and there isn't a whole pile of research on siblings, but they can be very, very hurt. They can be kind of jealous, because often if there's you know, their sister's taking drugs, the attention is all on her. And I'm the one that's doing well in school, and I'm not getting any kind of credit here whatsoever. And we often kind of speak in terms of they're the forgotten child. In terms of isolation, this is one of the things that people often find. I'll give you an example. If it's your partner, for example, that drinks too much or whatever, you're invited to a wedding. Maybe you don't want to go to that wedding because you're terrified that there'll be a row or there'll be an argument. So you start avoiding family occasions, you start withdrawing. You mightn't invite people over to your house. You mightn't invite the girls over on a Friday evening for a glass of wine. Only one, mind, but because you might be under a little bit of pressure to kind of make sure that he won't be there or that type of thing. I'm conscious that I'm talking about a lot about him, but we've also kind of seen recently in the last few years an increase in female substance misuse. So it's right, it's across both genders. Things like being victims of crime. You know, I'll give you an example. I worked with two parents, quite well-to-do people, lived in one of these leafy suburbs. It wasn't in Roscommon, even though I'm sure you have leafy suburbs too. But they lived in a kind of a quiet cul-de-sac, and all the neighbours got on well. And they used to have keys for each other's house and the alarm codes and things like that. And they'd keep an eye on each other's houses when they were away. And their son went and took all the house keys and burgled all the houses. And he stole jewellery and things like that that money can't replace and insurance can't cover and things like that. But for that family, the shame and the, you know, the sheer kind of embarrassment of it. And sometimes it's things like, you know, there's 20 quid in your purse and it's robbed, you know, and that 20 quid was to go and get the bread and milk for the breakfast or something like that. So it can vary. And we're often seeing, when I talk about drug deaths, drug-related intimidation is one that's happening an awful lot more. Dealers are becoming a lot more aggressive. And it's usually not the dealer themselves. They'll send along their little lynchmen or whatever. And that can take very, very kind of different guises. I worked with a woman in Galway whose son, he owed about maybe 3.5 grand. And they used to put Post-its in her letterbox. They didn't do anything to the house, they didn't damage property, but it frightened the bejesus out of her because they were giving her a little warning that they were there. When I worked down the country a few years ago, we had a situation, it was a very serious situation where parents decided to send their daughter away to go up the country and stay with an aunt because there was a threat of sexual violence. She was a 14-year-old girl, which was quite traumatic on her because, again, it kind of goes back to the sibling thing. She did nothing wrong. Her parents, in fairness, were doing their best to keep her safe. They couldn't absolutely protect her, but she felt she was being punished for her brother's drug use. She was taken away from her school and her friends and things like that. We've seen where people have been killed over drug debts, and the debts will continue. The families still have to pay even after someone has been killed. So it's a real kind of tragedy, and it's really, really devastating. And, you know, I suppose it also kind of ties back into stigma. When we were doing research ourselves over the last couple of years, this was the #1 barrier for preventing people from seeking support. And when we think about it, and when I asked people what was the stigma, and again, they felt they would be blamed for having an addiction issue in their home and maybe not solving it themselves. But also they were trying to protect their loved one. They were afraid to kind of say, it's my son. And I'd often hear things, it might risk his schooling, it might risk his job. I don't want to bring it to the attention of any service, really. And often, even when I work with family members, I'd say, well, you know, what's your daughter's name? Oh, I don't want to tell you. And I'm like, you know, I am a counsellor, I'm not going to tell anybody type thing. But there's that fear, there is that real sense of fear. And I'd say, well, let's give her a name so that, you know, it's not a secret. And I suppose this is the one thing that I would ask people is, even in terms of, every one of us here has an opinion on drugs, on drug users, on drug dealers, and on families that are impacted. And I would ask, just even have that kind of little conscious awareness of the difficulties that many of those families are going through. Am I doing okay? Perfect. And just to move on very quickly to children, it's a term that you might hear is called hidden harm. And often it's because children go through this without ever coming to the attention of services, without ever it being picked up in school. You know, they have stress, you know, and as our previous speaker mentioned, a healthy childhood sets the foundation for a healthy life. If a small child is carrying that level of stress, even now when I meet clients, they may never even mention, you know, that there was a history of alcoholism in the family or something like that, and they might come to me about relationship issues or anxiety or something. And then we go back and it'll come up. Actually, I used to hear them fighting all the time. I remember being frightened in bed and things like that. So there's a whole kind of knock-on effect in that. And living in an unpredictable home environment is absolutely counterintuitive for what we actually want for children. Stability, security, safety, the basics that we need for children. Trust issues, not knowing even what adult to trust, you know, because parents can be inconsistent. We'll often talk even to young children and they'll know when mom or dad are going to have a hangover. They'll know to stay away, or they'll know to get up in the morning and make their siblings breakfast and get them out to school. Again, we can talk about self-esteem and avoidance and that whole kind of concept of lost childhood. You can't put a price on that, and you can't kind of put a value on the damage that can actually do down the road. We talk about dysfunctional relationships. I kind of don't like the word dysfunctional, but I think we're all a little dysfunctional, I know I am. But in terms of relationships, when they go forward, they haven't had good, I suppose, guidance or role models and things like that. So that can be quite difficult. And just even here in terms of ACOA, which often is a term known as adult childs of alcoholics, and these are the 17 kind of symptoms that people will bring into adulthood. And when they bring that into adulthood, they then bring it into their relationships, which in turn has an impact on their children going forward. So I'm nearly done. I just want to kind of say, when we think about addiction within families, that just to be kind of aware, if you don't mind, of the impacts that it has on the whole family. I know I couldn't go into them all here this evening. I'll give you an example of a woman that I worked with down in Limerick a number of years ago. She had 2 sons. One son got cancer, he was a form of leukemia, and her other son took up drugs really around the time that her other son got diagnosed. And what she said to me was, people called to the house, people offered help, they brought stews, they brought apple tarts. Her neighbour took the washing and washed his, did the washing and drying and things like that because her son had cancer. She said nobody brought her an apple tart for the son that took drugs. And in a kind of a cruel turn of events in some ways, the son that took the drugs did die of an overdose. And she always spoke about the hypocrisy when people came to the funeral because she didn't feel supported when her son was sick. And what she said was, both my boys were sick and only one recovered. If there's more information that you'd like to know, we do have a handbook, it's downstairs. Please feel free to take copies. Please feel free to give copies to other people. And if you want a bit some support, you can contact us at the Drug Task Force, or you can have a chat with me later for anything like that. All right, thanks very much.